Flight attendant slaps black woman in first class, unaware she is the FAA administrator. The morning sun had just begun to shine through the large glass windows of the international airport. The building was alive with the sound of rolling suitcases, quick footsteps, and the voices of travelers speaking in different languages. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, rushing to catch their flights. In the middle of all this movement, one woman walked calmly, her steps steady and confident. Her name was Dr. Elaine Parker, though few people in the airport knew her true identity. Elaine was not just any traveler. She was one of the most respected figures in aviation, the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. She had spent years working to make air travel safer for millions of passengers around the world. Yet, despite her important position, Elaine was a humble woman. She didn't like to draw attention to herself. On this morning, she wore a simple navy blue jacket and carried a black leather handbag. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was one of the most powerful people in the airline industry. As she approached the gate, she pulled out her boarding pass and passport. The gate agent scanned them with a smile and welcomed her warmly. "Have a wonderful flight, Miss Parker," the agent said, unaware of the weight that her name carried in the aviation world. Elaine smiled politely, thanked the agent, and made her way down the jet bridge toward the aircraft. Inside the plane, flight attendants were busy preparing for takeoff. They helped passengers find their seats, stored luggage in the overhead bins, and made quick conversations with frequent flyers. In first class, the wide leather seats gleamed under the soft cabin lights. Each seat had a blanket neatly folded, a small pillow, and a bottle of water placed on the armrest. Elaine walked to her seat C2A, by the window. She placed her handbag neatly under the seat in front of her and sat down. For a moment, she looked outside the window, watching the ground crew move quickly as they loaded luggage and checked the plane. She took a deep breath, ready for the long flight ahead. But just as she was getting comfortable, she noticed a flight attendant approaching her. The woman was in her early 30s, tall, and neatly dressed in the airline's uniform. She had sharp eyes that seemed to scan everything with suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said with a clipped tone, "are you sure you're in the right seat?" Elaine looked up, surprised. She calmly handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant, who glanced at it quickly. The paper clearly showed C2A, first class. The attendant frowned slightly. She muttered, as if something didn't quite fit. "Well, make sure you stay in your assigned seat. This cabin is reserved for first-class passengers." The words stung a little, not because of what was said but because of the way they were spoken. The tone carried an assumption, as if Elaine didn't belong where she was sitting. Still, Elaine didn't argue. She simply nodded, smiled politely, and placed the boarding pass back in her handbag. Other passengers had noticed the small exchange. Some glanced at Elaine curiously, wondering why the attendant had questioned her. Elaine, however, remained calm. She had experienced moments like this before, moments where people judged her based on appearance rather than reality. She chose not to let it disturb her peace. As more passengers boarded, the cabin filled with the rustling of coats, the click of seat belts, and the low hum of conversations. A businessman across the aisle opened his laptop and began typing quickly. A young couple behind Elaine spoke softly about their vacation plans. The energy inside the cabin was a mix of excitement and weariness, the usual atmosphere of a flight about to depart. The same flight attendant returned a few minutes later with drinks for the passengers. When she reached Elaine, her smile looked forced. "Water, juice, or champagne?" she asked. "Water, please," Elaine replied kindly. The attendant handed her a glass but gave no further warmth or courtesy. Again, Elaine noticed the difference in treatment. The passengers around her received friendly chatter, even compliments on their outfits or questions about their travels. For her, the service felt cold, distant. Elaine sipped her water quietly and turned her gaze back toward the window. Outside, the aircraft next to theirs was being pushed back from the gate. She thought about how many people trusted airplanes every single day, and how her job was to make sure those flights remained safe. She carried the responsibility with pride, but she also carried it silently, never needing to remind anyone of who she was. Yet, beneath the calm surface, there was a growing sense of unease. She could sense the flight attendant's eyes returning to her more than once, checking her with a look of doubt. It was as if the attendant was waiting to catch her doing something wrong. Elaine wondered why people so quickly judged without knowing the truth. As boarding came to an end, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We'll be departing shortly. Please take your seats and fasten your seat belts." The cabin crew moved briskly through the aisles, checking seat belts and reminding passengers to turn off their devices. The same attendant stopped once more at Elaine's row. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass again," she said. Elaine raised her eyebrows slightly, surprised by the repeated request. Still, she stayed calm. She reached into her handbag, pulled out the pass, and handed it over once more. The paper had not changed, it still showed her seat clearly. The attendant studied it longer this time, then handed it back reluctantly. "Very well," she said, with a hint of disbelief. "Just remember, this cabin has rules, and I expect all passengers to follow them." Elaine gave a small nod. She could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on her again, silently questioning why she was being singled out. But Elaine refused to let the moment disturb her. She had faced much greater challenges in her life than a stranger's doubt. She adjusted her seat belt, leaned back, and closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. The engines roared to life, vibrating softly through the cabin. The plane began to move away from the gate, heading toward the runway. Elaine opened her eyes and looked around the cabin. She noticed how relaxed most of the other passengers were, chatting with ease, while she sat under the watchful eye of a flight attendant who had already decided she didn't belong. Deep down, Elaine knew that this was just the beginning of something. She didn't yet know how far the situation would go, but she sensed the tension building in the air. She had boarded the plane simply wanting a quiet journey, but destiny had other plans. This flight was going to become a story no one on board would ever forget. The airplane slowly climbed into the sky, leaving the city below as tiny dots of light. Inside the cabin, the sound of the engines created a steady hum. Most passengers settled into their seats, pulling out books, magazines, or simply leaning back to rest. In first class, the service was meant to be calm, relaxing, and pleasant. But for Elaine, the atmosphere felt different. She tried to focus on her book, a travel memoir she had brought along, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every few minutes, when she lifted her eyes, she caught sight of the flight attendant's sharp gaze flickering in her direction. The woman's smile would return quickly when speaking to other passengers, but with Elaine, there was none of that warmth. Elaine had traveled countless times before, and she had always believed that first class was a place of ease, where passengers were treated equally well. Yet here, she felt a quiet wall being built between her and the others. She told herself not to let it bother her, but the tension grew stronger with every small exchange. The first sign came during the meal service. The cabin crew brought trays of food, carefully placing them in front of each passenger. A man across the aisle received a polite explanation of the menu, along with a cheerful smile. A woman 2 rows ahead was even offered extra bread with a friendly laugh. But when the tray reached Elaine, the tone shifted again. "Here," the flight attendant said shortly, setting down her tray without the same introduction or courtesy. Elaine glanced at the tray: salmon with rice, a fresh salad, and a slice of cake. She thanked the attendant softly, but the woman didn't respond. She simply moved on to the next row as though Elaine had not spoken at all. Elaine sighed quietly, cutting into her food. It wasn't the lack of words that unsettled her, it was the constant reminder that she was being treated differently. Around her, conversations floated easily, laughter filled the air, but she felt like an outsider in a space where she was supposed to belong. A man sitting nearby leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Don't let it get to you. I saw how she spoke to you earlier." His voice was kind, his eyes sympathetic. Elaine gave him a small smile. "Thank you," she replied. "I'm used to this kind of thing. I try not to let it change my peace." The man nodded, impressed by her composure. Still, it hurt Elaine deep down that in a world she had worked so hard to make safer and fairer, she was still being quietly pushed aside. Hours passed as the plane moved steadily across the sky. The lights in the cabin dimmed, signaling that it was time for passengers to rest. Some reclined their seats fully, others watched movies on the small screens, and a few closed their eyes and drifted to sleep. Elaine tried to rest, but her thoughts kept circling back to the day's events. She remembered her years of hard work in aviation, the late nights studying reports, the endless meetings, and the difficult decisions that shaped the safety of millions of travelers. She thought about how her role carried great responsibility, yet here she was, reduced in the eyes of someone who didn't know her story. The flight attendant returned again during the night hours. This time, she noticed Elaine's small carry-on bag tucked under the seat. With a disapproving frown, she leaned down. "Your bag looks a little large for under-seat storage," she said curtly. "It really should be in the overhead compartment." Elaine looked at the bag. It was a standard size, well within the rules, and it fit perfectly under the seat without bothering anyone. Calmly, she answered, "It's within the airline's requirements. I checked before boarding." The attendant pursed her lips, unwilling to accept the explanation. "Still, I'd prefer if you moved it." "Rules are rules." Elaine considered her words carefully. She could have pushed back harder, but she chose patience once more. "If it becomes a safety issue, I'll be happy to move it. For now, it's not in anyone's way." Her voice was calm, steady, and polite. The attendant gave her a sharp look but didn't press further. She walked away briskly, her disapproval clear in the tension of her steps. Elaine leaned back in her seat, letting out a slow breath. She knew this was not about rules, it was about assumptions. She had learned long ago that sometimes people decided who you were without ever asking, and once they made up their minds, everything you did was judged through that lens. The hours of the flight continued to stretch forward. The plane passed over oceans, its wings gliding steadily through the clouds. Elaine tried to close her eyes again, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she thought about her family, her colleagues, and the many people she had met who believed in fairness and equality. Those thoughts brought her comfort, reminding her that not everyone judged so quickly. As morning began to approach, the cabin light slowly brightened. Breakfast was served: eggs, fruit, and coffee for those who wanted it. Elaine asked politely for tea. The attendant set the cup down with little care, and some of the liquid spilled onto the tray. "Careful," the woman said sharply, as if the accident had been Elaine's fault. Elaine stayed silent. She picked up a napkin and wiped the tray herself. She sipped her tea slowly, her movements graceful despite the sting of the words. Other passengers exchanged glances, clearly aware now of the unfair treatment, though none spoke openly. One older woman sitting a few rows ahead turned in her seat and gave Elaine a reassuring smile. Elaine returned the smile, grateful for the small gesture of kindness. Sometimes, even silent support carried great weight. By now, the repeated actions of the flight attendant had created an invisible divide in the cabin. Elaine could feel it. The air was heavier, the stairs longer. She tried to remind herself that she had faced challenges before and had always risen above them. This flight would be no different. Yet, she also sensed something building, an unspoken tension, a fragile line that might break if the treatment continued. She didn't know how or when, but she felt the story was far from over. As the plane flew high above the clouds, Elaine sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She carried herself with dignity, refusing to respond with anger or frustration. Inside, she reminded herself of the values she had always lived by: patience, respect, and grace under pressure. The journey was not just about reaching her destination anymore. It was becoming a test of character, a mirror reflecting both the assumptions of others and the strength within herself. And though the hours stretched on, Elaine knew she would meet whatever came next with the same calm spirit that had guided her through every challenge in life. For now, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, waiting, as the quiet hum of the engines carried the plane closer to the moment when everything would change. The long hours of the flight rolled by, and the sky outside shifted from soft shades of blue to the golden glow of morning. The cabin lights were now brighter, and the attendants moved about preparing for the second round of service. Passengers began to wake from their naps, stretching in their seats, chatting lightly, and adjusting themselves for the last leg of the journey. Elaine sat quietly in her seat, her posture composed, her eyes calm as she flipped through a few pages of her book. She had managed to keep her peace despite the repeated coldness shown toward her. Yet, she could feel the energy around her changing, as if something was about to happen. The flight attendant, the same one who had questioned her earlier, returned to the cabin with a tray of drinks. She handed glasses of juice and coffee to passengers in the row ahead with pleasant greetings and polite remarks. But when she reached Elaine's row, her manner hardened once again. "Move your bag," she said suddenly, pointing to the small carry-on tucked neatly under the seat. Elaine looked at the bag. It had been there the entire flight without issue. "It's within the rules," she replied softly. "It's not blocking the aisle or anyone's space." The attendant's face tightened. "I said move it. Put it in the overhead bin." Elaine considered her words. She could feel the eyes of nearby passengers turning toward her, waiting to see how she would respond. She spoke calmly, her voice even. "The bag is not in anyone's way. It's not against the policy to keep it where it is. I'll be glad to move it if it becomes a safety concern, but right now, it's fine." The attendant's eyes flashed with irritation. For reasons that Elaine could not fully understand, the woman seemed determined to challenge her at every step. Her voice rose slightly as she leaned closer. "When I give instructions, I expect them to be followed. Do you understand?" The tension in the air grew heavier. A couple across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man 2 rows behind whispered quietly to his companion, "Why is she treating her like that?" The murmurs of unease began to spread. Elaine, however, remained steady. She looked at the attendant with patience. "I respect the rules, and I always follow them. But there's no need to raise your voice. I'm not breaking any rule by keeping the bag here." For a moment, it seemed the flight attendant might walk away. But instead, her frustration reached a breaking point. In an impulsive act that stunned the entire cabin, she leaned forward and, with a quick motion, struck Elaine lightly across the cheek. The sound was small, but the effect was enormous. Gasps filled the cabin. The businessman across the aisle dropped his newspaper in shock. The young couple behind Elaine froze, wide-eyed. Every passenger who had witnessed the moment sat in silence, their disbelief filling the air like a heavy fog. Elaine did not react with anger. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting gently in her lap, her eyes calm. The only movement she made was a slow, steady breath. Her dignity in that moment stood taller than any raised voice or impulsive action could ever reach. The cabin was frozen. The flight attendant herself seemed stunned by what she had done. She quickly straightened, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time during the flight, her confidence faltered. Passengers began whispering, their voices filled with shock and disapproval. "Did that just happen?" someone murmured. "I can't believe she did that." Another voice said firmly, "This is unacceptable." Elaine turned her gaze to the window for a moment, as if gathering strength from the steady clouds outside. Then, with calmness that seemed almost unreal given what had just happened, she looked back at the attendant and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Do you realize what you have just done?" The attendant swallowed hard but said nothing. Her earlier sharpness had disappeared, replaced now by a nervous silence. Another flight attendant, drawn by the commotion, hurried over. She looked from Elaine to her colleague, confusion written across her face. "What's going on here?" she asked quickly. Passengers immediately spoke up. "We saw everything," one man said firmly. "She hit her." Completely unprovoked. Another added, "She's been mistreating her since the start of the flight." "This isn't the first incident." The second attendant's eyes widened in alarm. She looked at Elaine, then back at the shaken colleague. "Is this true?" she asked in disbelief. Elaine did not raise her voice. She did not demand or accuse. She simply spoke with a dignity that filled the space. "I have been patient all through this flight," she said. "I was questioned about my seat, spoken to without courtesy, and now this. I did not come here to cause trouble. I only came to travel peacefully like everyone else." Her words, calm yet powerful, seemed to echo in the cabin. Passengers nodded in agreement, their faces showing support. The captain was notified almost immediately. Within minutes, he appeared at the front of the first-class cabin, his uniform crisp, his expression serious. He listened carefully as passengers explained what had happened. He looked at Elaine with respectful eyes. "Ma'am, I am deeply sorry. I assure you this will be addressed. Please know that your safety and dignity matter on this flight." Elaine gave a small nod, her composure still steady. She did not reveal who she was, not yet. She chose instead to wait, to let the truth unfold in its own time. The flight attendant who had struck her stood silently now, her confidence gone, her face pale. She seemed to realize the gravity of what she had done, though words failed her. The cabin remained heavy with silence, the shock still hanging in the air. Passengers whispered quietly among themselves, glancing at Elaine with admiration for the grace she showed under such unfair treatment. Some even muttered words of support under their breath. "She handled that with such strength," one said. "I wouldn't have been so calm," another admitted. Elaine, however, sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded once more. She had no need to prove anything in that moment. Her composure had already spoken louder than any outburst could. She knew the time would come to reveal the truth of who she was, but for now, she chose patience. The engines continued their steady hum, the plane pressing forward across the sky. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. The balance of power, the perception of the passengers, the weight of silence, it all pointed to the fact that what had just happened was more than an isolated incident. It was a turning point, one that no one on board would ever forget. Elaine looked once more out of the window, her eyes soft but steady. The clouds moved past like waves, endless and calm. In that quiet moment, she reminded herself of something she had always believed, that dignity could never be taken away by the actions of another. It was something carried within, untouchable by misunderstanding or judgment. Still, she knew the story of this flight was not yet complete. The revelation of who she truly was had not yet been spoken. And when it came, it would change everything. For now, she sat silently, letting the cabin breathe in its own shock, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. The cabin was filled with silence, but it wasn't the ordinary quiet of a flight in the sky. It was a heavy silence, thick with shock and discomfort. Passengers who had been speaking minutes ago now whispered only in hushed tones. Some kept looking at Elaine, others at the flight attendant who stood frozen a few steps away, her eyes downcast. The captain remained near the front of the cabin, speaking quietly with one of the senior attendants. His expression showed concern. He was a professional, but even he could not hide the seriousness of what had just happened on his flight. Elaine sat still in her seat, her hands resting gently in her lap. Her calm presence was almost stronger than words. Even after what she had experienced, she had not raised her voice or demanded attention. Instead, she waited. And though she had not revealed her identity, her patience seemed to command more respect than any title could. The senior flight attendant, the one who had arrived after the incident, walked carefully back toward Elaine. She bent down slightly, her voice soft. "Ma'am, on behalf of our crew, I want to apologize for what you've experienced. This is not how any passenger should be treated, especially not in this cabin. I promise you, the airline will take this seriously." Elaine looked at her, her eyes calm but steady. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do hope this becomes a moment to reflect, not just for the one who acted, but for everyone who witnesses." Her words carried a weight that filled the ears of those nearby. The older woman a few rows ahead nodded quietly to herself, clearly moved. The flight continued, but the mood in first class had shifted completely. The flight attendant who had caused the incident kept her distance, avoiding Elaine's gaze, her earlier confidence now gone. Passengers whispered about what had happened, their voices filled with disapproval of the behavior they had seen. An hour passed before the captain returned to the cabin. This time, he approached Elaine directly. He stood beside her seat, his hat tucked respectfully under his arm, his voice steady but respectful. "Ma'am," he said, "I understand you've been patient throughout this entire situation, and I thank you for that. Please know, I take responsibility for my crew, and I will make sure this is addressed properly when we land." Elaine looked up at him, her eyes kind but unshaken. She knew the time had come. The silence had lasted long enough. The truth needed to be spoken, not for her own pride, but for the lesson it carried. She set down her book, folded her hands, and spoke clearly so that those around her could hear. "Captain, I appreciate your words. But I believe there is something you and your crew deserve to know. My name is Dr. Elaine Parker. I am the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration." The air in the cabin seemed to stop moving. The captain blinked, his mouth parting slightly in surprise. The senior flight attendant standing nearby stiffened, her face paling instantly. A murmur spread quickly through the first-class cabin as passengers repeated the words they had just heard. "The FAA administrator," someone whispered in awe. "She's in charge of the entire aviation system." Another voice said, "She's the highest authority in air travel." Elaine's words had changed everything. The passengers now looked at her not just as a quiet woman enduring mistreatment, but as a leader whose authority touched every single airplane in the sky. The captain's voice returned, but softer now, filled with respect. "Dr. Parker. I had no idea. Please forgive us." "If I had known." Elaine raised her hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "That is exactly the point, Captain. You should not have to know who I am in order to treat me with respect. No passenger should have to carry a title to receive basic dignity. Whether I am the FAA administrator or simply someone traveling home, I deserve the same courtesy as anyone else." Her words cut through the cabin with quiet power. Every passenger felt them deeply. Heads nodded slowly, and the weight of her message settled on everyone present. The captain lowered his gaze, humbled. "You are absolutely right," he said firmly. "There is no excuse. What you've endured is unacceptable, and I will personally report this to the airline's highest office. Dr. Parker, your words will not be ignored." Elaine gave a small nod, satisfied not because of her title being recognized, but because the truth had been spoken aloud. She had held her silence long enough. Now, she wanted this moment to serve as a reminder of fairness, equality, and the importance of respect. The passengers began to look at her with new eyes, not just admiration for her title, but admiration for her composure. Some whispered words like, "She handled it with grace," while others simply watched her in quiet respect. The flight attendant who had mistreated her stood frozen a few rows away. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For the first time, she understood the gravity of her actions. Not only had she disrespected a passenger, but she had struck the very leader who oversaw the skies she worked in every day. Elaine turned her gaze toward the attendant. Her voice was steady, not harsh, not loud, but firm. "You made a mistake today. Not just with me, but with the trust every passenger places in this airline. I hope you take this moment as a lesson, not as punishment. You cannot undo your actions, but you can grow from them." The attendant's eyes welled up slightly, though she said nothing. The weight of the words was enough. The rest of the cabin sat in silence, the moment heavy with meaning. Elaine had not demanded revenge, nor had she raised her voice. She had simply spoken truth with dignity, and in doing so, she had turned the entire flight into a classroom of humanity. The captain gave a respectful bow of his head. "Thank you, Dr. Parker, for your patience and your wisdom. I assure you, your words will leave this cabin with every one of us." Elaine leaned back in her seat once more, her composure unbroken. She did not need applause or recognition. She had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. Outside the window, the clouds drifted by, soft and endless, as though the sky itself had been listening to the exchange. Inside, the passengers settled back into their seats, though the atmosphere had completely changed. What had started as a tense and heavy silence was now a silence of reflection. The truth had been revealed. And with it, respect had been restored. The airplane continued its steady journey across the sky, but after Elaine's revelation, the entire cabin felt different. The energy in first class had shifted from silent shock to thoughtful reflection. Passengers who had witnessed everything now sat with a mix of awe and respect. They whispered quietly to each other, glancing at Elaine as though they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Elaine herself sat with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the flight. She had not raised her voice, nor had she demanded anything. Yet, with a few calm words, she had reminded everyone of the values of respect and fairness. She looked out of the window, the clouds glowing gold in the sunlight, and thought about how life had a way of turning ordinary days into unforgettable lessons. The captain returned once more, standing beside her seat with a respectful posture. His voice was steady, but softer than before. "Dr. Parker," he said, "I have contacted the ground team already. There will be officials waiting when we land. The airline will make sure this is addressed immediately." Elaine nodded gently. "Thank you, Captain. I trust that you will handle it. But remember, this is not only about me. It's about every passenger who deserves respect, no matter their background, appearance, or seat." Her words were simple, but the message behind them was powerful. The captain bowed his head slightly in agreement before returning to the cockpit. The flight attendant who had mistreated Elaine remained at a distance, her face pale, her posture tense. She avoided the passengers' eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the reality of her actions. The crew around her treated her with quiet disapproval, though no one spoke openly. It was clear she would face consequences upon landing. As the plane descended, passengers prepared for arrival. Some gathered their belongings, others adjusted their jackets, but many couldn't help glancing at Elaine one last time. A few even offered kind words as they passed her seat. "You showed incredible strength," said the businessman across the aisle. "You reminded us all what true dignity looks like," added the older woman a few rows ahead. Elaine smiled softly at their words, but she did not linger on them. She had never lived her life for recognition. She only wanted the moment to serve as a reminder that kindness and fairness should not be optional. When the wheels touched down and the plane rolled to the gate, the cabin filled with the familiar sound of passengers unbuckling their seat belts and reaching for the overhead bins. But before anyone could leave, uniformed airline officials and airport security personnel boarded the plane. Their expressions were serious, their steps purposeful. The captain led them directly to Elaine. "This is Dr. Elaine Parker, FAA Administrator," he said, his voice filled with respect. "She has experienced unacceptable treatment on this flight." The officials nodded, greeting Elaine with courteous bows. One of them spoke quickly. "Dr. Parker, we are deeply sorry. We will personally escort you to ensure everything is handled properly." Elaine stood gracefully, collecting her handbag. She turned to the passengers around her and gave a small nod of thanks. Many nodded back, their expressions showing admiration. She then turned her gaze toward the flight attendant who had caused the incident. The woman's eyes were filled with regret. She looked down, unable to meet Elaine's steady gaze. Elaine spoke gently but firmly. "You made choices today that hurt not only me, but the trust every passenger places in you. I hope you take this moment seriously. Growth is possible, but it begins with acknowledging the harm you've caused." The attendant swallowed hard, her lips trembling, but she said nothing. Elaine did not linger. She stepped forward with quiet grace, accompanied by the officials. The other passengers watched as she walked down the aisle, her presence leaving behind a silence filled with respect. For many, it was a flight they would never forget. Once inside the terminal, the airline's senior representatives greeted her. Apologies flowed quickly, promises of thorough investigation were made, and steps toward disciplinary action were explained. But Elaine kept her words simple. "Make this a lesson," she said. "Train your staff to see every passenger with fairness. It should not take a title for someone to be treated with respect." The representatives nodded earnestly, their faces showing the seriousness of the moment. They knew her words would carry weight beyond just this flight. News of the incident soon spread, not through Elaine herself but through the passengers who had witnessed it. Some shared their experiences with friends and family, others spoke to the press. The story traveled quickly how a respected leader had been treated unfairly, how she revealed her true identity, and how she responded with grace instead of anger. But Elaine did not seek attention. She returned to her office days later and continued her work as she always had, focusing on safety, fairness, and improvement in aviation. When asked about the incident by colleagues, she simply said, "Respect should never depend on recognition. It should be given freely, to all." The airline involved launched new training programs for its staff, emphasizing dignity, fairness, and the importance of treating every traveler with care. The incident became a reminder to the industry that assumptions had no place in customer service. For the passengers who had been on that flight, the memory stayed fresh. Some described it as a powerful lesson in patience and strength. Others said it changed the way they viewed leadership, not as power displayed loudly, but as dignity carried quietly. As for Elaine, she carried on with the same humility she had always shown. She didn't let the incident harden her heart. Instead, it strengthened her belief that change often begins in small moments where patience and dignity speak louder than anger. The flight that had begun like any other had turned into a story of justice, reflection, and growth. And though the world moved on, those who had witnessed it would remember forever the calm strength of the woman who had sat quietly in seat 2A, reminding everyone that respect is not a privilege, but a right.